Last year, we were pretty much all over Jonathan Taylor. We talked about him a lot in the offseason. His ADP actually went in the opposite way. Sometimes we think if we talk about these players in the offseason, their ADP is going to rise, and that can be the case. But with all that was going on with Jonathan Taylor last offseason, Carson Wentz obviously picked up an injury. There was offensive line injuries. That ADP dropped a little bit, but we drafted Jonathan Taylor in a lot of drafts last year, and that worked out really well for us. We've got a lot of questions coming in this year as to who could be this year's version of Jonathan Taylor. So the guy that's kind of maybe a little bit undervalued, ready to break out or ready to bounce back, maybe, as we'll talk about on today's show. But Jonathan Taylor, I think, we talk zero RB a lot, but when we aren't going zero RB, we're definitely Jonathan Taylor guys.
We are Jonathan Taylor fans. And I mean, the obvious answer to who the 2022 Jonathan Taylor is would be Jonathan Taylor. But you got to pay the 101, not a pick at the 1-2 turn. That makes a big difference, obviously. When we were looking at Jonathan Taylor last year and emphasizing his selection, I put together an article looking at his profile, how elite he was as a prospect. Now, this is a guy who came in and more or less broke the running back prospect lab. And the running back prospect lab is a tool that I really like because it does help you separate the absolute stars from a lot of players who maybe are good, and they can be good fantasy players. But the guys who are going to come in as, not necessarily generational prospects, if you have 4, 5, 6 of them, but we're looking at these players who are at the very top, right? And so Taylor comes in, and his prospect lab comps are guys like Ezekiel Elliott, Todd Gurley, Melvin Gordon, Leonard Fournette, the very top guys. And one of the reasons that group was interesting is they come in as these big athletic players, and as they go through their careers, the receiving workload tends to tick up a little bit. And you can see that from the whole group. And by the time that you get into season 2, and especially now in season 3, and so we've written about it again, so you're expecting a player to have the ball in his hands a lot and in all possible ways because he is so dynamic. Obviously, we've seen that from Jonathan Taylor. If anything, he's the best player from that group. You're talking about a size-speed combination that's almost unreal, and the ability to generate long runs that round out a profile that would be elite without those long runs. So Jonathan Taylor, pretty unique. There's not going to be one every season. There isn't one for 2022. And so that's our kind of first point. We might be in a situation where next year that Breece Hall is kind of moving into the portion of his career where we would start to look for that type of outcome from him. And he might be the kind of guy where in year 2, he gives you that elite win rate. But Colm, even though we don't have a pure Jonathan Taylor pick for 2022, there are a couple players who we might look at as having some elite elements to their profile and definitely the ability to generate win rates far above where they're being drafted.
Yeah, and we don't want to just dampen the mood straight away, Shawn. Maybe these guys still sneak into that category. Maybe these two guys we're going to talk about will do what Jonathan Taylor did last year. But that was an extremely fun season. And there was, like I mentioned at the start of the show, there was quite a few things working against him to actually do that. You mentioned, having the ball in his hands. He probably should have had the ball in his hands a little bit more than he did last year with the Colts, but he was so dynamic, so explosive, fantastic to watch, and quite rightly going as the first pick in most drafts this year overall. So that is Jonathan Taylor. But this year, we're looking for that player that's going in the late second round, early second round that could then potentially give you a massive return on that selection. And Ben and Shawn talked recently about the running backs that they target, and Shawn is very selective in those running backs, and rightly so. But when these guys are put on the list, I think they're definitely ones to keep a very close eye on. And we're not going to talk about Breece Hall today, but you did touch on him, and he is somebody to definitely keep on your draft radar for 2022. But the first one up, Shawn, is at the ADP of kind of between 15 and 16. So in that early second round in most drafts. And it was somebody who we really loved last year, who was going a couple of rounds later, but did show production throughout the season. Finished the season injured, unfortunately, but that was DeAndre Swift of the Detroit Lions. And you've outlined a number of reasons here why he potentially fits that mold as a running back who can really outperform that ADP.
And obviously we want to find the next Jonathan Taylor, but in some cases it makes more sense to find the next Austin Eckler or Alvin Kamara, something that's more realistic to find, at least in this case with the players that we have available to us. And DeAndre Swift really fits that pattern. We had a great article from Ryan Collinsworth, really a fantastic series a couple of years ago. And one of his points was that Austin Eckler is Alvin Kamara, right? And once he gets a little bit more of a workload, and you looked at, how he's used, how dynamic he is in that role, the types of touches that he dominates with, the two players are just so identical. And I think at that time, when Kamara is basically the best fantasy back in the NFL, and Austin Eckler is this sort of space back, handcuff second stringer, people are going to look at that, raise their eyebrows, and say, well, he's a good pass catching back, but let's be reasonable. Now we have Austin Eckler in the middle of the first round and one of the highest scoring backs in the NFL. You look at DeAndre Swift, and it's very easy to see why he would be the next back to take that leap and really be a top 5 pick if he could just stay healthy, right? And you look at what he did last season, the numbers really speak for themselves. He's number 1 in targets per game. He's number 4 in receptions per game. He's tied for number 2 in target share. He's number 2 in yards after the catch. He's number 6 in high value touches. And that's interesting because he did miss some of the end of the year. The only player with more high value touches who was also ahead of him in terms of high value touches per snap was Leonard Fournette. And we know the kind of workload that Fournette had last year, where he's basically catching all these dump offs and rushing at the goal line, the dream workload for any running back. And it's not like we even have that much projection when we're looking at DeAndre Swift. He is at 18.6 points per game through week 11. And if you are on the Swift bandwagon at that point, and by bandwagon, I mean, if you'd been drafting him during draft season and you were now playing him every week, you just felt absolutely golden. This guy was going out and crushing your league for you. Unfortunately, he gets hurt in week 12, and that more or less does it for him. And so you had to have some depth. One of the interesting things that kind of jumps out there is that at that point in the season, he was at 18.4 expected points per game, which was actually barely ahead of Jonathan Taylor. And so when we talk about having the workload that you need in a back who is also very explosive, he was right there. The other thing that he had done was to really eliminate a lot of the competition. And we went into the season, and a lot of people were expecting this committee between Swift and Jamal Williams. Williams, a pretty solid back, and the Lions had made a big deal about how it was going to be a committee. From week 4, which is really where he started to consolidate through week 11, the week before the injury, he was at a 77% snap share, which is really getting up there, especially on a team that did want to mix in some other backs. So again, we're talking about a variety of things that raise that floor for him as well. And then just kind of to throw in a little side note that I like is that he was number 8 in the NFL in terms of yards before contact per carry among backs with at least 100 carries. And of the players ahead of him, only Rashad Penny had a better evasion rate. And then you go and you look back to his rookie year, and Swift was elite in terms of yards before contact in that season as well. Swift, one of these guys where the big play is there, the athleticism is there. I always look at someone like Jamal Charles as being the perfect example of how being elite in yards before contact, having that athleticism to get through the line and make the first guy miss, create these big plays. And even when everything isn't blocked up perfectly. Now, some people are going to say, well, the Lions have a pretty good offensive line. And that is probably true, but it's also good for him going forward, right? So we're looking at a guy who can create the big play as a runner. He's an elite receiver. And you can kind of look at this either way. I think they've added a lot of target competition. And so if a skeptic wanted to look at Swift's situation and say, well, I mean, he's not going to be the number 2 back in the NFL this year in terms of share of his team's targets, because there are going to be more targets going to Chark. There are going to be more targets going to Williams. You didn't have a situation last year, even where TJ Hawkinson was healthy at the same time that Amon-Ra St. Brown had emerged as a legit NFL weapon. So the passing game is going to run more through the downfield guys. And there's a possibility of that. And yet we've seen how offenses like the Chargers and the Saints can attack through the receiver weapons and still get a lot of value out of the running back in the receiving game. We'll see if some of that carries over as the Lions have made some shifts in the way that they are going to run the offense, the way they're going to call plays. But it just would be very strange to de-emphasize a player like DeAndre Swift in the receiving game when he's such a big weapon there. And the flip side of it is that if this offense is more dynamic, and we have a lot of reasons to believe that it will be, I mean, you could be talking about DeAndre Swift as a huge touchdown scorer in 2022.
Yeah, and you mentioned Leonard Fournette earlier in that in terms of the high value touches, and the offenses were very different between the Detroit Lions and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in 2021. But I do think this offense will be better. I also think that the targets that he's going to get is going to be different to some of those other guys potentially that you mentioned. But I do still think they're going to be behind in a lot of games. And for anyone who did draft Swift last year, the fourth quarters of those games were quite delightful, as those points, particularly in PPR formats, did start to pile up. And something else with DeAndre Swift, he has obviously been in the NFL for a couple of seasons now, but just turned 23 in January of this year as well. So still has that youth on his side, still room to progress and improve. So I think he is very, very intriguing in that kind of second round range. The other player, Shawn, that we're going to talk about is in the NFL a little bit longer, but you mentioned Jonathan Taylor and how he came into the NFL, his previous comps, being a generational type talent. Sometimes we throw around that phrase, you know, a lot. It gets thrown around a lot. It's a bit like who's a legend or who's a GOAT. There's like, you know, they do get thrown around. But in terms of generational prospects, Saquon Barkley was certainly one of those coming out of college, started off his career very, very well, has been really derailed by injury more so than anything else. And kind of a very unfortunate injury last year in the way that he did get kind of rolled up on and missed a good chunk of the season after having worked his way back. But Saquon Barkley still did show some flashes last year at certain points, and he's heading in now as a veteran running back, but I think that there could be a lot of value there in him in 2022.
And Barkley is a player, as you mentioned, who comes in with this crazy score in the running back prospect lab. We're talking about guys who are in this 95 to 100 range. You know, Barkley, depending on exactly how you build the model, is going to be up there 98, 99, 100. And the reason that he's actually not in that comp group for Jonathan Taylor is that Barkley was always there as a receiver. He's not someone that you needed to make the argument that he's going to build into it and the team is going to use him more. He's someone who comes out as a rookie and averages over 11 expected points per game just as a receiver, right? So, I mean, Saquon Barkley, an absolute superstar as a rookie. He has double-digit EP as both a rusher and a receiver. He's at 21.6 overall. When we're looking at players who should be drafted in the first 5 picks, we're looking at guys who have that type of workload and then have the ability in any given season to add on 3 or 4 fantasy points over expectation. And now you're in that 25, 26, 27 range where that player is going to generate an incredible win rate for you. As long as the rest of your roster is built properly, you're going to dominate and you're going to be there at the end in big tournaments. When we look at DeAndre Swift, for example, and we talk about his expected points, you can even say, well, all of those high value touches are great, but there could be a sustainability issue. There are a lot of ways that could play out. And if the high value touches aren't there at quite the same extent, then his EP drops down a little bit. And you're talking about someone who maybe isn't quite as appealing. And yet, when you look at Swift within the context of what Eckler and Kamara do, he hasn't had, or he didn't have last season, that year where his fantasy points over expectation get into the Kamara Eckler range. And maybe he doesn't have that in him either because of his own talents, because of luck, because of the offense. But one of the things that could balance out a slight regression in terms of the quality of his touches would be that he could be better with them. And he could have that 4 or 5 FPOE season where then the overall profile is there. With Barkley, really all we're talking about is needing him to be back to what he was. And in terms of what he was, it was very fleeting. You even look at the second year, very good again, but those EP numbers dropped from 21.6 per game to 17.6. So you're losing 4 points. And that's a lot. But the question obviously for us is where is he now? The bigger concern most drafters have is not, is it going to be, in the 17.5 range, but will it be anything at all? What does he have left? And the fact that he's still a relatively young back doesn't necessarily mean anything. I mean, we've witnessed a lot of these stars of recent vintage. After you have these injuries, then you're just never the same. And you can be never the same as a 24, 25, 26-year-old. And that's one of the things that is pretty frustrating for the players themselves, much more than for us as fantasy managers, but for fantasy as well. I think there are a handful of really positive potential notes for him, right? Number one is that he's a year removed now from that serious injury, or has another year to have gotten back to full strength from the ACL. And really last year, what caused him the problem was the ankle sprain. And those can be very serious also. They're all a little bit different. We know that Michael Thomas has never really returned from his serious ankle injury, but the indications are that Barkley is 100%. He's going to be very involved in this offense. We talked about the yards before contact for Swift. I think a lot of that goes on him, but you look at someone like Saquon, who in the past has been elite after contact, but hasn't had great numbers before contact. The Giants offensive line has been a train wreck. That's been one of the issues that they've had as they try to unleash him. They've really worked to improve that. Now, whether it takes right away, we don't know. But there's a possibility that he will get a lot better blocking. And then with that, he's going to have a better coaching staff, a better offensive scheme. And so those 3 big elements really push back in the direction of thinking, okay, he could be someone who not only looks more like the player, at least from year 2, if not from the rookie year. One of the things that does happen for these running backs, especially the stars, is often they come in and the best season, the most explosive season. And you look at Ezekiel Elliott, and the most explosive season from an efficiency perspective is going to be that rookie year. Then he added some volume elements to that and bumped up the numbers and held them for a couple of years. But these guys can come in and it's difficult to hold that. But even if you look at his second season, if he can be that within the context of a better offense, I mean, how is he going at the 2-3 turn? And the reason is just, again, this concern about the injuries and if he'll ever be the same type of guy. But if he is, the upside is huge. There's minimal competition for him there. The Giants have made it very clear that they expect to use him as a receiver. And that's great, number one, from the perspective of those are high-value touches. And then number 2, when you talk about a back like Saquon Barkley with that size, athleticism profile, you get him out there on the edges, you get him in space. That's very difficult for the defense to deal with.
Yeah, and I'm really just rooting for him as well, just as a player. The talent coming in, we just haven't really got to see a full run of it, like you mentioned there, with the injury history. So hoping that he is going to bounce back in this season as well. He feels like he's at a real apex in his career. If he hits this season, the career is probably going to be extended by 3 or 4 years as our NFL running back. And if he misses this year, then it's going to be harder and harder for him to continue to be the starting running back for the Giants, first of all. But then if he's not with the Giants, getting a contract with another team, the players going in and around the range that he is going are the likes of Nick Chubb, James Conner, Breece Hall, Cam Akers. Then we have David Montgomery, Antonio Gibson, and Ezekiel Elliott, who you mentioned there. There is a couple of guys, obviously, like James Conner is one of our favorite guys, but I think that's at the peak of his ADP. It's a little bit problematic as to how early he is at this point. But outside of Breece Hall and that list of names that I rounded off, I think that I would be really thinking that the upside there to be in those top 5 running back picks in 2023 is with Saquon Barkley. So I think there's a lot of excitement and a lot of support behind him if he can hit this year. So they are the 2 guys that were fitting into that mold. As Shawn said at the start, there's only one Jonathan Taylor, so nobody's going to take that role in 2022. But somebody who can be a Jonathan Taylor kind of minus maybe, but let's see how it plays out this year.